Hello, and welcome. I'm Goblin, and tonight we will be reading stories from my favorite website for first-hand paranormal experiences, Your Ghost Stories. However, if you are familiar with this series, you'll know that despite the name of the website, ghosts are rarely the subject matter of the stories we read. Normally, we concern ourselves with various strange creatures, and tonight is par for the course. Tonight, we are getting into my favorite paranormal, supernatural, magical entities, fairies. Nothing fascinates me quite like fairies. Perhaps it's my lineage from Irish grandparents. Who knows? But I've always loved fairies, and I've always longed to see a fairy. And maybe you are thinking to yourself that no one has seen a fairy, but you're wrong. Maybe. Who knows? But tonight, we are going to be reading 5 first-hand accounts from people who claim to have seen fairies. In addition to reading the stories, I'll be going over some folklore and fairy lore as it comes up throughout the show. So, if all that sounds good to you, let's get started. Our first story is from user Bob Harridges in Michigan, and it's called The In-Betweens You See in the Corners of Your Eyes. When I was about 12 or 13 years old, I began to see something. A short man, about 4.5 feet tall, with a burlap vest and long pants torn off just below the knee. I'd been seeing something out of the corners of my eyes for quite a while by this time, but nothing so drastic as this. I was wandering into my parents' bathroom to grab something, but about 5 or 6 feet before I reached the door, I stopped and saw him out of the corner of my eye, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed and one leg crossed over the other. His stance was ominous, but not evil, or maybe I just couldn't detect it if it was. Now, usually he would appear in places at different times and then just vanish, but this time he lingered. I stood there frozen, not out of fear, but bewilderment, as he ran abnormally fast right through my direct line of vision, and then took a sharp turn which led him right next to me, no further than a few inches from my face. Suddenly, he began to quickly mutter something in a loud whisper, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. When he was done, he paused for a moment, then vanished. Even though he was in the corner of my eye, I should have been able to pick up on some distinguishing characteristics, but all I could see was a nose, eyes, mouth, and shaded face that I cannot elaborate on. This incident didn't trouble me in the slightest, but I did think about it quite often. After that, he didn't appear to me again until I was about 17 years old. He would once again only appear in my peripheral vision, then vanish even before I would attempt to look directly at him. I kept this event secret due to the fear of ridicule, but I decided to converse with a friend about it a year ago when I was 19. Even though he was a good friend, I expected an awkward response, but received quite the opposite. He had had a similar experience with a very tall figure, about 7 feet tall, who wore a burlap jacket instead of a vest. He had seen the figure on the side of the road while traveling back to his home state of Alabama, and I am since more open about this subject. The last time I saw my figure was in mid to late August of the year 2007. I was driving home from work at about 10:30 p.m. and there were no houses on the strip of road I was on, and no other cars either, so there was no other source of light to distort my headlights. He walked across the road, about 8 feet in front of my car, at a slow pace, but he seemed to be moving at the same pace as my car, because I was still moving, but I did not get any closer to him. He walked all the way across the road to the opposite side, and once again vanished. I'm now almost 20 years old, and it is late November, and I still continue to see him occasionally. I don't know who or what he is, but I've heard them called in-betweens because they most often appear in doorways and other passages. Very cool story. I know what the author means when they say that they saw this being out of the corner of their eye, in their peripheral vision. It's common for people to see fairies this way, and I'm not sure if that's because we normally lack the ability to see such creatures head on, or because fairies don't allow themselves to be seen openly. The author mentions at the end that they have heard that these beings most often appear in doorways and passages, and calls them in-betweens. I think that's a good name for them. Fae creatures are believed to be most easily perceived in liminal spaces, or twixt and tween places, where the boundaries between worlds, realities, or dimensions may be thin. Crossroads are another such place, and it is my personal belief that corners hold the same mystical properties. It's another meeting place of sorts. In the case of a room, a corner is a place where two or more walls meet. To me, the corner of your eyes is a thin place as well. It's literally called your peripheral vision, and a periphery is a boundary, a border, an outer limit, a fringe area. It's where your vision is blurred and things are just out of sight. A thin place if I ever heard of one, and a very valid place to see fairies, ghosts, and things just outside of our vision. Our next story is from Mexico, written by user Heya, and it's called Very Little People. For many of the people who come from Mexico, you know that it is just filled with ghost stories and myths. For all of you who don't know, well, now you know. There are many, many stories and myths told in the town where my parents are from. I have heard about many of them through my parents who have heard these stories from the older women who used to sit around together outside of their houses in the evening telling these supposed ghost stories. One that I heard in particular from my grandmother really caught my interest. My grandma said that when she was little, her mother used to tell her about these tiny little people that were supposedly mischievous and would always steal small personal objects in your house if you weren't careful. Now, she said they weren't harmful at all, but they always came when you weren't looking. She blamed the loss of many objects on these little people. My grandmother, of course, wasn't one to easily believe in such things, until one day, later on in her life, she said she happened to come across one. She said she was just sitting in her house one day. For those of you who are not familiar with a Mexican house, usually the house has a type of courtyard or patio right in the middle where it is open so there is sun and sky coming in. And she had her eyes closed, just relaxing, when she felt a tug on her pants on one of her legs. She ignored it and kept her eyes closed. Again, she felt a tug on her pants and she thought it was a cat or something. And when she opened her eyes, her shoe on one of her feet was gone. Later that day, she found the shoe down where the animals were, by this big door leading to a large yard in the town river. This happened again the next day, and she said she was determined to catch that cat. Only this time, after the second tug, she opened her eyes and said, "I got you." And to her surprise, it was a tiny little man, almost like a fairy, only without wings or anything. He was running with her shoe, but then he dropped it. One time, one of my aunts saw one and ran out of the house across the street to the neighbor's house. Now, this isn't my story, but for some reason I feel like there are all types of different things we don't understand and cannot explain. I was wondering if anyone could give me any information on what these little people could be, or if they even exist. The two people, my grandma and my aunt, had these experiences at different times. My grandma, having hers first, had not told anyone about it until my aunt told her story. Could it be that they both saw the same thing? I must say, I would love to sit and hang out with this group of women the author mentioned at the beginning of the story. The older women who sit around together outside of their houses in the evening telling ghost stories. Why can't we have that in my neighborhood? Even though the word fairy comes from the Western world, and those who hear that word probably most often associate it with English, British, Irish folklore, and have a very particular picture in their mind of how a fairy should look, fairies, or beings resembling them, exist in all cultures. Mischievous or playful behavior is common for fairies, They mention it in this story, and perhaps you've heard before that fairies, goblins, gremlins, etc. are often blamed for objects going missing around the house. Socks, jewelry, remote controls, keys. I think by writing and researching this topic, actually, I might have conjured some fairies for my sister, because the night I wrote this section about fairies being mischievous and stealing things, she sent me a text message saying that she couldn't find her remote control for her TV. And obviously, it's something we use a lot, right? We usually know where it is. So she tore her living room apart, looked under couch cushions, the whole thing, and finally just had to pull out a backup that she had and started using it. And then when she sat down to watch TV, she felt something under her where she sat, and it was her remote control. Just right there in the middle of the couch. So, I'm sorry, sis, if I conjured the fairies and sent them to your house. But she's not the only one. A comment from Encartophile says, "Sometimes I will have objects go missing. It's usually something that I need, and I know where it was last. Then, as soon as I stop needing it, it will turn up exactly where it should be. I've had things only just set down, move to weird spots across the room. My friends and I jokingly say, the gnomes are at it again." Another interesting comment comes from Vulcan10, who says, "When I lived in Kenwood, Oklahoma for a short time, the Cherokees, this was an all-Cherokee town, but not a reservation, located in northeastern Oklahoma, believed in little people they called Junstees. Many people there had Junstee stories." And this commenter wasn't sure of the spelling of this word, they just typed their phonetic interpretation, but I was able to find out what they were talking about, and they are called Yunwi Junstee. This translates from the Cherokee language to little people. Although they are generally invisible to humans, when they do appear, they present themselves as tiny people with very long hair. They are creatures of nature who inhabit the different landscapes of the earth and are generally benevolent and will even assist humans, such as guiding lost people back to safety. However, anyone who disrespects them will be punished harshly. So, the Yunwi Junstee are examples of fairies in the Cherokee folklore, and many, if not all, native peoples have some version of these very little people. Let's move on to our next first-hand encounter. It's from Florida by Cav Scout, and it's called Creature of the Woods. My story takes place in the woods next to my house in Spring Hill, Florida. There were two sets of woods separated by a retention pond that was always a barren wasteland. Me and my neighborhood friends were all playing manhunt, and it was approximately 10 p.m. We were all running around, jumping and diving and hiding from each other. I ran and jumped in a patch of overgrown grass, then something ran and stopped right in front of me. As I focused on it, I saw two skinny, green-striped legs. I could only guess the height of this creature was about 3 to 4 feet high. I tried to keep up, but it started running, so I decided to chase it, and I ran as fast as I could. Now, I was 17 years old at the time, and in great running shape, so as I started to get up, it ran. I chased after it, and I could see the branches and bushes move as it ran from me. It was only maybe 2 to 3 feet from me the entire chase. While I was chasing it, I couldn't actually see it, only the branches moving, and hear the noise it was making as it was running away from me. But once the woods ended, and it met the blacktop, road, and houses, the creature disappeared. I asked my friends about this creature, and they have all seen it, but no one has been able to capture it or get a picture of it. My friends and I have still tried to look and capture or get proof of the creature yet, but no luck. What could this be? That's a fun, cute little story. I like the green striped stockings, although maybe it is a little almost stereotypical fairy garb. I know when I was growing up, there was lots of images of fairies wearing striped stockings, but maybe that's just some accurate documentation of fairy fashions. Who knows? And then I did want to read this comment that the original poster wrote. They kind of go into the description of these legs a little more. They said, "Picture, if you will, the stocking of like a leprechaun. They were green with darker green stripes. It was very odd. And at that age, I simply chased after it until the end of the forest, then nothing. A lot of my friends have seen this thing, whether it runs or leaps in the trees, but only at night. Now, when I told my grandma this, she told me it sounded like a leprechaun wanted to keep you away from their gold. I have moved, but I still drive by the woods and wonder. And P.S., while you're in there, it feels as though you are being watched." Since in the history of time, we have no photographic evidence of fairies, and no, the Cottingley fairies don't count, I'm sorry. I would say that fairies are probably pretty good at avoiding being seen, so I don't know, it's probably kind of useless to try and get a photo of a fairy. And honestly, if I did see a fairy, I think that's the last thing I would do, was whip out my phone. I think it's probably a little disrespectful. They don't want their photo taken. So, respect their privacy and just enjoy the experience, because it's a very rare one. But maybe I spoke too soon. Speaking of photographic evidence, and that leads us to our next story, which was posted by Wardo from Arizona, and it's called "I May Have Seen Fairies." In early November of 2016, I invited a longtime friend to my house to catch up. My wife was out of town with our daughter for the weekend, and I was wanting some company. My friend came over and brought a 12-pack of beer. Over the course of the night, I would like to say that I probably drank maybe 4-5 beers. That's a lot of beer for me to drink these days, and I only drink on rare occasion. Take it for what you will, but I have never hallucinated while drinking alcohol, and I was not incapacitated to the point that I did not have my faculties about me. Suffice to say, I had a nice buzz. My friend and I were sitting on the back patio chatting and sipping our beers. It was probably around 11 p.m., rounding off the end part of our visit. We had the outside light off, but there was an adequate amount of ambient light coming through the Arcadia door and neighborhood streetlights and such. We had been chatting for a couple hours, and our conversation drifted to paranormal and unexplained phenomena, as it tends to. My friend told me that his sister-in-law recently obtained some kind of certificate that proclaimed her to be a fairyologist. She asked him if he would like her to place an enchantment spell on him that would enable him to have fairy companions and bring him good luck. My friend accepted the offer, and the next day she gave him a purple feather. She told him that he should carry the feather on his person if he felt like he might need good luck, and be prepared to see fairies. He's relating this story to me when he pulled the feather out of his pocket to show me. He then nonchalantly tells me that there may be a fairy or two that would come around and pay us a visit. I said I thought that would be cool, not thinking much of it. Around 20 minutes later he says, "Oh look, the fairies are here." He points up above my head, and I look up to see 2 insect-like creatures silently hovering above my head, around 3 feet above me. As I looked up to see, I could see these 2 illuminated insects slowly descending upon me. I stared transfixed as they slowly and intently floated down in the straightest, slow line until they were right in front of my gaze, hovering there. I could not make out any details, and they made no noise. I gasped a little bit and fidgeted uncomfortably in my chair. I told him, "Okay, if this is a prank, you got me already." He said, "Of course it's not a prank. I wouldn't do that to you. I only let you see because I've known you most of my life. I trust you, and I know you're open to this sort of thing." I then confessed to him that it was making me very uncomfortable, and that maybe I would like to go inside and call it a night. He said he was sorry, and didn't mean to scare me at all, and there was nothing to fear. They immediately shot off at a distance, although I could still see them for a minute. After several minutes, they were nowhere in sight. I kept pressing him to stop messing with me. I insisted to him that he had terrified me well, but he maintained that it was a real experience. Around midnight, he asked if I would like to see them again. I quickly looked around to make sure that there was nothing around me, and I told him that I would like to see them before we ended our evening. In my mind, I thought this was the perfect opportunity to debunk this joke. I kept a lookout for anything around me to make sure there wasn't some type of moth or flying insect that he could use as a joke on me. I saw nothing. He said to calm down or they wouldn't come around because they could sense tension and would avoid it. I tried in vain to calm myself until I finally just sort of let it go after some time. The conversation shifted until he looked me in the eye so intently and said, "Are you ready?" I said, "Yes." I asked him if I could take their picture, and he said I could try. He said, "Okay, they aren't so close this time, but there is one near that other chair, an empty chair adjacent to me." I looked over and saw the insect-like creature leave its perch on the seat of the chair and begin hovering towards me slowly. The creature had wings that batted so quickly, they appeared to be a stationary blob. It moved with such flawless control though, like it could decide precisely how it wanted to move about. Well, I got my phone out and started snapping pictures like a maniac. I tried a video too, but it unfortunately did not show anything that could be deciphered. So here I will point out that there are images of this fairy for you to see. I will show the originals and the blown up versions of what I determined are the best 2 photos. The other photos had either only part of the fairy visible or were distorted in some way. The author, Wardo, takes time to point out that although they have had other paranormal experiences, they have 8 stories published on Your Ghost Stories. This is the strangest they've had yet. They also say that they were not embellishing any details, and he's aware of the power of suggestion, and that he's sure people will point out that he was drinking. Although I did note the fact that he was drinking as well, I will say that I've been at varying degrees of intoxication in my life, and I've never once seen a fairy during those times, but who knows. So the author did share the photos he took from that night. I'll show them to you now. Now, I will give you my input on these photos, but I'm not trying to discredit the author's experience because I wasn't there. I'm just saying that to me, the photos look like insects caught in a flash. Actually, this one, which he says is the best photo, looks like something that people in the paranormal community call rods or skyfish, and are believed to be some sort of alien or cryptozoological creature that are invisible to the naked eye and can only be caught on a photograph or video recording. Some people believe that and stand by that, but a lot of people have been able to recreate this effect by taking photos of flying insects in low lighting with the flash on. But it's hard to tell exactly what is in these photos because they are just reflective blobs and shapes, and the author of the experience did say that they appeared sort of like insects. So, unfortunately, I don't think we can consider these pictures to be definitive proof of fairies, but that's okay, and it doesn't have to necessarily take away from the author's experience. I think the experience is what matters. And again, I would say, if you do find yourself in a fairy encounter, as much as you like to try and get photographic proof, don't try and take their picture. Just enjoy the experience. Maybe you think that's silly not to try and take their picture when we have the capability to do so in an instant, but that's just what I think. Also, I did find the website the author mentioned where their friend's sister became a fairyologist, and I wanted to share it with you real quick. It's not active anymore. I had to find it on the Wayback Machine, so I'm not sure if you can still become a certified fairyologist. Hey, if it got you the ability to see fairies, I'd do it. Alright, moving on to our final story of the night. It's from the Philippines by author F.N. Obles, and it's called Strange Man in the Woods. This is a story from when I was 6 years old. I was in the Philippines, where I grew up, and was taking a vacation to my grandparents' house in a province called Aklan. Me and my parents usually live in Manila, but if there's no school, I will visit my grandparents' home and stay there until school starts again. My grandparents' house is on the top of a mountain, so you can't see anything but trees around it. The main road is 15-20 minutes walk from their house. It's very remote. My grandfather on my mother's side was alive at that time. Back then, he would take me outside to take a stroll or sightseeing. I was his first grandchild, so he always pampered me. One day, it was in the afternoon, My grandfather and I were taking a stroll on the mountain. He was holding a big knife, which he used for cutting weeds and branches, and a big sack. He said that we will try to find fruit or vegetables that we can take home to Grandma. I remember when we were walking in the woods, we came across this big mango tree. Usually mango trees are short enough for people to reach its fruit to harvest, but this tree was not. It had a lot of green mangoes on it, perfect for harvesting. My grandfather said he would try to poke the mango from the tree using a stick that he found lying around so that they fell to the ground. And while he was doing that, he told me that if a mango falls to the ground, it's my job to put it into the big sack that he brought. Suddenly, an unknown man came to me. He was wearing a white shirt and blue jeans, but he wasn't wearing any shoes. He said to come with him and that he will show me something. As a 6-year-old child, I didn't really know the concept of don't talk to strangers. He looked to be in his mid-20s, handsome, with tan skin, so I go with him. I don't know what happened, but as I was following him into the woods, we came across this huge house, a mansion, and on top of that, it's a gold mansion. The door opened on its own before us, and when we got inside, even now I don't believe what I saw, but all the interior, the floor, the ceilings, table, chair, carpet, you name it, it's all gold. I mean literally gold. Even the bookshelves and books are gold. So when we were inside the house, there's a big staircase in front of the door where we came in. It was like a staircase from a movie, the width of 2 cars. So we went up, and after we got to the top, I saw this long table. This table, too, is like something you'd see in a movie, or like in a royal mansion, with maybe about 10 or so chairs. There's different types of foods, delicious foods. It's like the food you serve when there's any festive event happening, like New Year or Christmas, with utensils at the side and an empty glass. The strange man asked me to sit on the chair, so I did. After that, he reached for a plate on the table with lots of food and placed it in front of me. On this plate was white rice. Well, it looks like white rice, except the grain is moving. It looked like tiny little worms moving on a plate. He offered it to me and asked me to eat it, but I said no. I didn't want to eat it because I saw it moving and I thought it was worms. After rejecting his offer, he didn't say anything. He just said okay and that he will bring me back. So I followed him. We went downstairs and through the door. After I went through the door, I don't know what happened, but it suddenly went white. There was a light that was so bright that I couldn't see in front of me, and I had to close my eyes. The next thing that happened is I heard my grandfather shouting my name. And guess where I was? I was on top of the big mango tree, and my grandfather was under the tree, looking for me. I called my grandfather. He turned around and saw me up in the tree. I remember seeing my grandfather's worried and confused face. Even a grown man couldn't climb it by himself. Since my grandfather couldn't reach me, he told me to just jump down the tree and that he would catch me. So I jumped from the tree, and my grandfather caught me. He then picked up his knife that was laying on the ground and ran with me in his arms out of the woods and back to our house. Once we were back home, my grandparents asked me what happened. My grandfather told my grandmother what happened in the woods while we were picking mangoes, that I went missing. He couldn't find me, and then he saw me on the top of the tree. I told them about what happened, about the strange man, the big mansion, the gold things, and even the food the man offered me. My grandmother said that she was glad I didn't eat the food this man offered. I asked why. She said that the man I saw might be one of the guardians of the forest, or a fairy. She said that if this man or this guardian offered you food and you eat it, you will not be able to go back to the present. You will stay there with him and will remain missing forever. She said that maybe the reason the man approached me was because he had a strong urge to make me his. Till this day, I will never forget that experience. Even now, my grandmother and I talk about it. Oh, I forgot to mention, my grandfather and his friends decided to go back to where the mango tree was to investigate it, but strangely, the tree was nowhere to be found, almost like it was never there in the first place. That story is marvelous, isn't it? It's like a fairy tale. Seriously, it has so many elements of fairy tales to it, but also many common themes that appear in fairy encounters and fairy lore. A beautiful stranger appearing out of nowhere.
Where did you spring from?
Who whisks you away to a golden palace. The long table with a bountiful feast that upon closer inspection is rotted and repulsive. I have to agree with the author's grandmother, it's a good thing she didn't eat any of the food offered. If there's anything I've learned from fairy tales, it's that you absolutely do not partake in food or drink given to you when visiting another realm. They are most likely enchanted and will some way harm or ensnare you. Fairies have been known to delight in taking humans prisoner back to their world, almost like a person may want to take home a wild or stray animal back home as a pet, and they have a particular interest in human children. Not all fairies are good, after all.
I thought they did nice things, like granting wishes.
Huh? Shows what you know, don't it?
Some may argue that fairies aren't good or evil, for these are human morals, and fairies have no use for such notions in their world, the world of nature. There are lots of comments I want to read, so let's get started on those. The first one is actually from Amor, whose story we read in the Haunted Hikes episode. She says here, "Wow, I heard a similar story before. I always wondered about the veracity of it. My relatives in the province were talking about this distant cousin. She had a similar experience. She was constantly invited over by strange friends who lived in a golden mansion, but she refused to eat any food on the table, especially a plate of black rice, which she was offered. She called the people her friends, but one day she disappeared. And the weird thing about it, she was said to have been found seemingly asleep in the forest, but she was lifeless. A ceremony was held, and she was buried, but her mother was grieving and asked to dig her back up and check if she was still alive. They only found a huge, cut-down banana trunk inside her coffin. Weird. I always wondered if it's true. I was a child when I heard about it, but the similarity is uncanny. Good thing you didn't eat the food." That's an interesting story. I've heard about a tree trunk being in the place of a body in a coffin only from a novel, one of my favorites, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I couldn't find any folkloric inspiration for this, but apparently it's a concept familiar to Filipino people because there were a few more comments about it. Being Trish says, "Oh my, it's good you didn't eat the food the man offered you. A similar thing happened to my high school classmate's cousin in the Philippines around the summer of 2003 or 2004, but it did not end well. Family and friends of hers, the cousin, believed she was taken by an encanto. She went missing, and later on they found her lifeless body lying next to a big acacia tree close to their home. According to the pathologist that did an autopsy on her body, they did not find trauma or any indication of diseases that caused her death. Just like what Amor said on her comment, it's like she was just sleeping when they found her body by the tree. After a few days, the body was replaced by a banana trunk, but they couldn't find the body in the coffin. It's so similar to Amor's story that I had to share mine too." If you didn't know, Encanto are elemental spirits in Filipino culture, sort of akin to elves. A comment by Fence Sitter says that accounts of cadavers being replaced by banana trunks are, quote, quite common on the islands of Negros and Panay. They also say that, sometime in the 1990s, I had the opportunity to work with someone who had the same experience as yours. He was from Iloilo. According to him, it all happened when he was still 6 or 7 years old. One day, while playing alone in their backyard, he was approached by a tall man who was garbed in a shining white coat and long pants. This man invited him to accompany him to their house in the woods where a feast was being held. He recalled quite clearly that the man had no groove on his upper lip and had some apparent hypnotic powers since he almost went with him, despite the queerness of the situation. The apparent spell was broken when he heard his mother calling out for him. He turned around to call back to his mom, and when he turned to face the stranger, the creature was gone. One last comment I'd like to read for you is from Chaos2, who says, "Westerners aren't familiar with stories like these, but in Asia, it's quite common. It does not happen all the time, but there are several stories. In Japan, they have stories like these as well, called Kamikakshi, or Spirited Away. One of my favorite movies. Anyway, there's lots more I'd like to explore on this subject, but sadly, that's all I have time for tonight. I want to make sure I finish this and get it out to you in time according to my schedule. If you didn't know, I post new videos every other week, normally on a Monday or Tuesday. Sometimes I'm able to put something out a little sooner than that, but I always try to put something out at least every other week. Rest assured, we'll talk more on this topic again. Like I said, I have a particular fascination with fairies. Thank you so much for joining me tonight and listening to the stories and my personal musings on the matter. I hope you have a magical evening. Why don't you take a walk in the woods sometime and leave your phone behind or switch it off? That way you aren't tempted to try and take a fairy's photo when you meet one. Keep your eyes peeled for those green stockings, although I've also heard that fairies are known to wear boots. Until next time.